To highlight the value proposition of what Weka brings in the cloud, here is a deployment perspective of a typical data pipeline. So you would have edge devices, whether they are IoT devices, sensor data, or market data, imaging data, been pushed into the cloud. And typically where it lands at a landing zone, which could be an object storage or an NFS cluster. From there, it gets copied to either a local file system on an HPC GPU cluster with leveraging local NVMe drives, or it also gets sent to an purely HPC cluster, which is separate from a compute. Then there is a backup copy or a DR copy been used for NAS and object store. And then there is also data movers, which are copy that same data onto a long-term data lake, which then uses tape servers for a backup copy and so on. So as you can see, there are several moving parts to this particular deployment. It results into storage silos and of course multiple copies of the same data at multiple different locations. But more importantly, from a business perspective, this results into delayed time to insights, delayed time to market, and a lot more complexity in terms of deployment. So all of those different storage silos can be consolidated into a single performance platform, which can cater to our entire pipeline, where you're doing high-speed ingest and you're getting to faster business outcomes. We are a multi-protocol data platform where you can do ingest using S3, you can expose using SMB or NFS, which are traditional protocols, but most of the performance advantages you gain with our POSIX agent, which is a complete, which exposes an entire POSIX compliant file system. In both these workflows, the data challenges are very similar. The storage platform needs to deal with small and big files. It needs to deal with several millions of files in a single directory. And this is a very challenging workflow where Weka, because of its mixed workload and performance advantages, as well as the built-in data management, is able to cater to these workloads extremely well.
So before I get into how we're using Weka and AWS, I want to mention just how would we approach drug discovery as computational people and using machine learning. I think this is a very interesting example where this is a particular protein from the coronavirus. And this is what we're looking at here is the structure of the protein. And in order to interfere with the protein and knock out the coronavirus, what we're going to try to do is design a small molecule that's going to bind to this protein, lock into the protein structure and interfere with it. And if you kind of look at this rotating protein, there's this little molecule, it's going to come back in a sec, little molecule that's binding. So the question is, how could we predict that molecule is going to bind to a protein structure? What we're looking at here is a protein structure with a particular small molecule bound to it. And we've developed a network that looks at it the same way as describing for images. In this case, instead of looking at pixels and grouping them together as edges and so on, we look at atoms and we say, okay, these atoms grouped together, that looks like a particular functional unit. And these other atoms in that relation to that, this looks like it all comes together. This is a good binding reaction, that now the ligand is bound well to the protein. And we can use that as a deep learning model for predicting what are good drugs for particular proteins. So in the early days, we're pretty small. We had only a few people and we didn't have so much data. So as you can imagine, we're able to handle our workload on a single server, just a single multi-core server with a single GPU attached, and just a local file system. So that's kind of where everyone would always start. As we grew bigger, we had more people, more ideas, more data. So we moved to the cloud several years ago, and our choice was AWS. And at that point, we've experimented with a couple different file systems. And basically, as we grew, as our data volumes grew, and as the number of people grew, we kept on reaching an inflection point where we needed faster and more performant and more scalable file systems. So we went through a series of iterations. NFS, Amazon's EFS system was working very well for us. We transitioned to AWS Batch for our on-demand computing, but everything was a little bit sluggish and we weren't getting the uptime that we were looking for. And so about a year and a half ago, we started to look around with how are we going to solve this problem? So we talked to Weka.io, and this turned out to be a very interesting solution for us, and I think we were very good partners for how this, for their particular offering. See a little bit about our particular architecture. As I mentioned, we've been running using AWS Batch, and so using AWS Batch, we're setting up elastic computing on demand, and we could be running anywhere from 0 to 10,000 instances on a particular day. There's quite a lot of projects work going on at Atomwise, and so we have a burst capacity to fairly large amounts of compute. We're started off on AWS Batch. More recently, we're now using Kubernetes and the AWS EKS service for that. So with that type of elastic computing, we're able to feed the instances using a Weka cluster. And here we're using 8 i3 X large instances. Those are all using an SSD drives for their backend. And with that in hand, I think this is the most exciting part of the slides, is that this is what we saw, benchmarking our performance. So this really started to enable us to think about things that weren't happening so quickly before and try different experiments. And I think a final takeaway point for how that worked for us is that not only were our model times much faster, but there's this ability to write to S3 and read back very quickly using a Weka server changed our game quite a lot. We could now consider experiments that earlier, because of all these headaches, it might take us 3 months to figure out how to run this particular experiment and get all of our ducks in a row. And now we could do this exact same experiments in just less than a week. So for me, it just really changed what our organization could think about and attack at the same time. And so for the cases like us, I think Weka IO is a perfect match for when you're doing distributed deep learning.